All right, so you know the drill. Welcome to another deep dive.
Okay.
And you guys sent in something pretty intense this time.
Yeah, this one's a bit different. Definitely more, I guess you could say, hands-on.
Uh-huh. Yeah, no, literally. This is all about self-defense, real-world stuff. We're diving into Krav Maga, real-world solutions to real-world violence by Gershon Ben Keren.
That's right. And before we get into it, the usual disclaimer.
Right.
We're not self-defense experts or
Yeah,
anything.
yeah, definitely not giving advice here. This is purely for informational purposes, exploring the book's concepts, so you can hopefully just be a little bit more aware, maybe think about these situations a little differently.
Exactly. And also, big emphasis on, if you're interested in this stuff, seek out qualified instruction, real training.
Totally. All right, so Krav Maga, where do we even begin? I mean, the book's pretty straightforward about what it is. It's a fighting system, right?
Yeah, developed for the IDF, the Israeli
Cool.
Defense Forces. So, born out of need for, like, super effective, no-nonsense self-defense.
Right. And the book really stresses that it's not just about learning moves, it's about developing a mindset. He calls it a survival mindset,
Right.
like understanding the principles behind the techniques, not just memorizing a bunch of, punches and kicks.
Absolutely. He even breaks the book down into these three main parts, which is actually a good way for us to approach this deep dive, I think.
Yeah.
Basic skills, then different types of armed assault, and then unarmed assaults and dynamic components of violence.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. Gives us a nice framework. So let's start with basic skills. Right off the bat, Ben Keren talks about this timeline of violence, which I found really fascinating. He breaks down any violent encounter into 5 phases.
Right. You have non-conflict, so basically everything's cool, no problems. Then conflict-aware, where you start to sense something might be off.
Yeah.
Then you have pre-conflict, where things start to escalate, verbally or through body language. And then, of course, the actual conflict phase, where the, physical stuff happens.
And finally, post-conflict, which is dealing with the aftermath, the legal and emotional fallout. But he really, really emphasizes that pre-conflict phase, like recognizing the signs that something's about to go down before it actually does.
Yeah, and this is where that awareness comes in. He talks about picking up on cues that the aggressor has harmful intentions. It could be what they're saying, how they're standing, even just a gut feeling that this isn't going to end peacefully.
Right. And he even mentions like specific scenarios where violence is pretty much guaranteed, like a robbery or an abduction attempt. The intent's pretty clear there.
Exactly. So it's about being tuned in, picking up on those subtle cues, and then knowing how to react.
And that leads us to what he calls the interview stance, which honestly, when I first read it, I was like, interview stance. But it makes so much sense. It's like that initial posture, that first line of defense when you sense trouble brewing.
Yeah, it's not a fighting stance, not aggressive, but it's also not passive. It's about projecting, I guess you could say, confidence, but also a willingness to de-escalate.
So walk us through it. What does it actually look like?
Okay, so you start with the foot of your non-dominant hand slightly forward. Your feet should be on opposite corners of an imaginary rectangle. Kind of like a boxer stance, but a bit wider.
Hmm?
And toes pointing generally toward them. It's about your hips being in line.
And your head.
Head directly over your hips. Super important for balance. You don't want to be leaning forward or back. Easy to get pushed over. And your weight should be on the balls of your feet so you can move quickly if you need to.
Okay, makes sense. What about your hands?
Hands are up, but palms open, facing them. Kind of like saying, whoa, hold on, I don't want any trouble.
He actually calls that a universal signal for stop and I don't want any trouble. So you're communicating, but you're also ready. What's that thing he says about no man's land?
Right. Those open hands create a kind of buffer zone. Someone can't just casually reach out and grab you. They have to commit to crossing that space, which gives you a bit of time to react.
Okay, so we're in the interview stance. Trouble's brewing. What next? Do we just stand there like a statue?
No, definitely not. Basic movement is all about sliding your feet. So you push off with one foot and slide the other, keeping that stance, that balance.
Sliding. That's interesting. So no, big steps or anything?
Nope, you want to stay grounded, ready to move in any direction instantly.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about multiple attackers? That's a scenario that honestly gives me chills just thinking about it.
Yeah, that's a tough one. And Ben Keren's really clear about this. Any movement towards you from anyone in that group, treat it as hostile until proven otherwise. The goal is to try and line them up so you're only facing one at a time.
How do you do that? I mean, they're not going to politely form a queue, right?
No, of course not. But you use that primary aggressor, the most aggressive one, as a pivot point. You move around them, trying to keep the others behind them out of your immediate space.
Okay, so kind of like hurting them, but in a fight.
Exactly. And if you have to focus on one, it's that main aggressor. They're the most immediate threat.
Makes sense. Now, the book also mentions a few other stances, right? Unprepared stance, semi-prepared, fighting stance. What are those all about?
Those are more about, I guess, different levels of awareness and readiness. Unprepared stance is basically you're caught off guard, hands down, not in good position. Semi-prepared, you're starting to sense something, maybe your hands are coming up a bit.
And fighting stance.
Well, he uses the fighting stance in training, but he actually says, in a real self-defense situation, if you have time to get into a fighting stance, you probably missed an opportunity to either strike first or get out of there.
So the interview stance is kind of like your default, your go-to.
Exactly. It's that initial response that I'm aware, I'm ready, posture.
Okay, so stances, movement, got it. Now, let's talk about striking. Ben Keren's pretty upfront about the idea of preemptive striking.
Yeah, and this can be a bit controversial, but he makes a really strong case for it. If violence seems unavoidable, if the aggressor's not responding to your attempts to de-escalate, or you can tell they're about to attack, hitting first can be the best option.
He even says to assume they're armed, even if you don't see a weapon.
Right, because giving them that first move could be fatal. And he outlines this preemptive striking combination, which he calls disrupt, damage, destroy, disengage. It's all about hitting those vulnerable areas, eyes, throat, groin.
And he starts with disruption, right? Like, even a poorly executed eye strike is better than a weak punch.
Exactly. It's about creating that initial shock, that pain that throws them off balance. Even if it's not a perfect hit, it gives you that split second to follow up.
And then we get to the groin kick, which, I mean, come on, it's a classic, right?
It is, but the book goes into some serious detail about the mechanics of it. Starting from the interview stance, you retract your hand, maybe from that eye strike, drive your opposite hip forward, raise your knee, and then bam, full force upward kick to the groin.
He does mention that it can be tricky to land a clean hit there.
Yeah, because of the, natural reaction to protect that area, people tend to pull their hips back, drop their hands. But even a glancing blow can be effective, disrupts them, causes pain, sets them up for the next attack.
And he talks about adjusting your footwork depending on their stance, like stepping off line if they have one leg forward.
Right. It's all about maximizing your leverage and targeting the most vulnerable spot. And then the details he gives about the kick itself, it's like heel to buttock, weight on the supporting leg, toes pulled back, aiming with the lower shin or instep, hip thrust for power. It's a lot more technical than just, kicking someone in the groin.
It definitely is. And then the combination continues with lead hand punches, rear crosses, a crashing elbow, and a driving knee. So these are more about like inflicting damage, right?
Exactly. The punches in the elbow, it's all about that hip rotation, generating power from your whole body, not just your arm. And the driving knee, he emphasizes forward momentum, like almost pulling them onto your knee as you drive it up.
And he briefly mentions that knee strikes can set up throws and takedowns, which, I mean, that's a whole other skill set.
It is, but the point is, striking effectively can create those openings.
He's also clear that fights rarely end with one punch. It's about combinations, about overwhelming the aggressor. And he makes a good point that knockouts are actually pretty hard to achieve. It's more likely that they'll surrender emotionally, when they realize they're outmatched.
Right. It's about that mental and physical breakdown, creating that window to escape.
Okay, so we've covered the offense. Let's talk defense. The book introduces the Krav Maga Yashir blocking system, which is basically what to do when you can't strike first and you need to block incoming attacks.
And this is where we see that emphasis on natural reactions again. He talks about the flinch response, that instinctive reaction we have to something coming at us. Krav Maga actually utilizes that flinch instead of trying to suppress it.
That's interesting. So it's not about like some fancy choreographed block.
No, it's about using that natural movement and refining it. So for circular attacks, which he calls 360 blocks, it's that quick inward and then outward movement of the forearm. And the focus is on reacting to the movement, not trying to figure out in that split second if it's a punch or a weapon.
He also talks about maintaining that 90-degree angle between your upper arm and forearm. Why is that so important?
It's about stopping the force, not just deflecting it. Like imagine trying to stop a car with your hand flat. You're going to get pushback. But if you hit it with your forearm at that angle, you have a better chance of stopping it.
Okay, that makes sense. And he adapts those blocks for different attacks, right? Like low attacks, upward attacks.
Exactly. If it's coming low, You drop your arm, bend forward, which also protects your groin. If it's coming up, like a knife thrust, you adjust the angle of your block.
And it's not just about standing still and blocking. He talks about movement, like stepping to the side while you block.
Yeah, you want to create angles, get off the line of attack. So if they're attacking with their right hand, you'd step toward their left shoulder.
And he even combines those 360 blocks with strikes, like punching while you block.
Right. It's about defending and attacking at the same time, using your whole body, that hip rotation for power.
Okay, so what about defending against straight attacks? Like punches or, a straight knife stab?
That's the inner forearm block. And the key here is leading with your elbow. It forces your body to turn, creating that pivot. And you're not just blocking, you're actually pulling their arm past you,
Yeah.
making them overcommit their weight.
And that leaves you in a good position to counterattack.
Exactly. He calls it the bladed position, where you're angled to the side, ready to strike. And this block's good for knife stabs too, especially when you can't use those closer range defenses.
Okay, so we've got a solid understanding of the basics. Now let's get into the heavier stuff. Part 2, different types of armed assault. And then Karen starts by saying that showing a weapon, it's usually about intimidation or forcing compliance.
Right. It's not always about immediately attacking. They want something from you, usually your possessions.
And he makes a distinction between those situations and situations where the intent to harm you is clear.
Exactly. Like a mugger wants your wallet, an abductor wants you. Different motivations, different levels of danger.
And he talks about this principle in Krav Maga Yashir, where the concepts for controlling and disarming guns and knives are actually quite similar.
Yeah, the focus is on the underlying principles, not the specific weapon. So things like where the weapon is, how the attacker's positioned, what they're trying to do, those are the important factors.
Okay, that's interesting. It's not about learning a separate disarm for every type of weapon. It's about understanding the principles.
Right, makes it more adaptable. And then he gets into specific scenarios like financial predators, which, we typically think of muggings happening in dark alleys, but he says it's often in crowded places.
Yeah, that surprised me too. But it makes sense, right? More targets, more cover for the mugger.
Exactly. And he talks about how muggers often synchronize their movements with the victim. They might approach directly, follow, wait, intercept. He even says to try changing direction. See if someone mirrors your movement.
He also mentions car key fobs. Like, just having them out can be a signal that you're aware.
Right. It's about projecting that you're not an easy target.
Yeah.
And then he gets into victim facilitators, those behaviors that can make you more vulnerable.
Like being distracted, not paying attention to your surroundings, looking down at the ground.
Exactly. It's like broadcasting, hey, I'm not paying attention, come rob me.
Then he goes through a bunch of specific scenarios, like knife load affront, which he says is common in muggings.
And his advice is, first, comply. Give them your wallet, your phone. But if they don't leave, that's when you react. The technique involves grabbing their wrist, pushing it toward them, pulling yourself back, and then securing their hand with your other hand.
And he covers gun to front of body, saying the principles are similar. Then he gets into those rear attacks, like knife to rear of body, low, which he says often happen at ATMs.
Yeah, those are scary. He emphasizes being aware of your surroundings, especially behind you. The defense is pretty complex, involving shrugging your shoulders, grabbing their wrist, stepping into them, controlling their arm, and eventually disarming them.
And gun to rear of body low follows similar principles. He really stresses compliance first, though.
Right. Give them what they want, but be ready to react if they escalate. And he also talks about using a disarmed gun as an impact weapon rather than trying to, figure out how to shoot it in the heat of the moment.
Okay, that's smart. And then he covers knife and gun threats to the side of the body. And again, those same principles keep coming up. Get your hands up, control the weapon hand.
Exactly. It's about establishing that basic defense first. And then he makes a really important point about sticking to the script during a mugging.
Right. Don't try to negotiate or be a hero. Just comply with their demands.
Exactly. Don't give them any ideas or try to fight back unless you absolutely have to.
Then he gets into threats against a wall where your movement's restricted. Those are tough.
Yeah. But he gives specific techniques for those too. For a knife at your throat, it's actually about pressing into the knife slightly to create space, then pulling down on their arm and using the wall to slam their head into it.
And for a gun against a wall where you can't move as much, it's about controlling the gun hand, pushing it down, and rotating it to break their grip.
Right. And then he talks about steaming, which is basically a mugging by a large group, often in crowded public transport.
Yeah, that one's terrifying. His advice is to change direction and get out of there as quickly as possible.
And be aware of those pre-violence indicators, like the group fanning out around you. If they confront you, initial compliance is key, but be ready to fight if they try to move you or escalate things.
Then he gets into even more specific scenarios, like a knife to the throat in a group setting, where he talks about using the attacker as a shield, and then, of course, the dreaded gun to the head.
That's the nightmare scenario. He talks about keeping your hands up, maybe even offering your wallet as a distraction, but avoiding sudden movements, not making eye contact, asking them questions to make them think.
And then the disarm, which is obviously super risky, grabbing their wrist, stepping offline, pulling the gun down and across, striking their wrist, and then using the gun as an impact weapon.
It's a last resort, but he breaks it down step by step. And then he gets into abductions and hostage situations, making that distinction between hostage-taking, where you're valuable to others, and abduction, where you're valuable to the abductor.
And he says that statistically, your best chance is right at the beginning, in that initial location.
Right, because the abductor's less prepared, their plan isn't fully in motion. And he stresses that not acting, that passivity, can actually reinforce their control over you.
He also mentions that denial, deliberation, and decision loop again, and how having pre-built responses can help you overcome that hesitation and act quickly.
Exactly. And then he walks through some rear hostage scenarios, like a knife to the throat while you're walking to your car.
Yeah, those are brutal. The defense involves throwing your head back, controlling their arm, getting behind them, and then basically running backwards into them.
Right. It's about creating space, disrupting their hold, and then getting away. And he covers a knife to the side of the throat, where you can't just pull down on the arm.
Right, because you'd cut yourself. So the technique involves pushing their elbow out, controlling their arm, trapping it against your head, and then stabbing upwards with the knife.
It's pretty intense stuff, but it shows the level of detail he goes into. And then he covers a gun to the side of the head, which follows similar principles to the knife defense.
And then there's a section on using your body to gain control over a resisting attacker.
Yeah, like when you can't break free immediately, he talks about using your body weight, leverage, and pressure points to weaken their grip and create an opening.
And then back to rear hostage situations, this time with a gun to the head. He gives the example of a robbery gone wrong, where they grab you as a hostage when the police show up.
And he breaks down the defenses for different holds, like an arm around the neck or the chest. For the neck hold, it involves turning towards them, controlling the gun hand, and then using your body weight to force them to release their grip.
And he touches on weapon retention, which he's basically covered throughout the book. And then part 2 ends with a more in-depth look at decision-making under stress, emphasizing that naturalistic decision-making, which is going with the first effective option, is often the best approach in these situations.
Right, it's about trusting your instincts, not overthinking things when every second counts. And having those pre-built responses can make a huge difference.
Right, final part, part 3. Unarmed assaults and dynamic components of violence. And he starts by saying that common unarmed assaults are things like pushes, pulls, punches, but headlocks often happen during a fight.
Right, it's not always that clean one-and-done attack. Fights are messy, they evolve.
And he emphasizes that good movement, range control, and striking can help you avoid getting into a headlock in the first place.
Exactly, it's about preventing it, if possible. And then he talks about rear attacks again, how they're the most dangerous because they're unexpected.
And he revisits that denial, deliberation, decision, action continuum, stressing the importance of reacting quickly.
Right, you don't have time to freeze up. And he gives a detailed defense for a rear strangle, which starts at those natural reactions. Hands going up to protect your airway, turning your head to breathe.
Then it's about pushing back, striking with your head, and then basically running backwards into them to break their hold and create space.
It's about turning the tables, becoming the aggressor, and then he describes how to apply an effective rear strangle, emphasizing the placement of the arm and the use of the shoulder for leverage.
Then he moves on to dynamic factors within a fight, acknowledging that fights can shift between striking, grappling, ground fighting, even weapons being introduced.
Right, it's not static, you have to be adaptable. And then he covers the front headlock, or guillotine choke.
He says preventing it is key by keeping your head out of that elbow crook. But if you do get caught, it's about protecting your airway, getting your hands inside their arms, and then using your legs and arms to break the hold.
Exactly. And then he mentions a couple of other chokes, the single wing clothing choke and the guillotine, but he doesn't go into much detail on those in this excerpt.
Same with fighting from a clinch and defending knees in a clinch. But he does cover side headlock prevention, which is again about keeping your head out of that elbow crook.
And if you do get caught in a side headlock, it's about hooking your arm under their armpit, attacking their eyes, and then using your hips and body weight to break free.
Then we move on to defending kicks. For a low kick, he talks about anticipating it by watching their footwork and then using a low 360 block reinforced with your other arm to drive into their leg.
And then it's about exploiting that opening, often by attacking the groin.
And for a straight knee attack, it's about using the opposite arm to block, reinforcing with your other hand, and then driving into their leg to create an unstable stance, again, opening up the groin for a counterattack.
It's all about turning their attack against them, using their momentum to your advantage.
And then he briefly mentions defending a rear headlock, which involves creating space and striking, and he reiterates the rear strangle technique. So, wow, that was a lot. I mean, this book is incredibly detailed and honestly a bit intense.
It is. But you can see the logic behind it, the emphasis on practicality, effectiveness, and using your natural reactions.
Absolutely. It's not about fancy moves or being some kind of superhero. It's about survival.
Right. And I think the biggest takeaway, besides the specific techniques, is that mindset he talks about. That awareness, that preparedness, that willingness to act decisively when you have to.
And as he says over and over, this book is not a substitute for real training. If you're interested in learning Krav Maga, find a qualified instructor.
Absolutely. Don't try this at home. And for you listening, maybe a final thought to consider. How can these principles, this awareness and preparedness, extend beyond just physical self-defense?
Right.
How can you apply them in other areas of your life to navigate difficult situations, to avoid unnecessary risks, to be more confident and assertive?
That's a good one. It's about being present, being aware, and being ready to act when you need to. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and stay safe out there.